It was the summer of 2012, and I was 29 at the time, working as a police officer in the outskirts of northern Montana. I'd been on the force for about 7 years, and by then, I had already seen my fair share of strange calls. Drug busts gone wrong, armed standoffs, missing people cases that led deep into the woods. But what happened that week, during that camping operation in the middle of nowhere, still plays in my head every time I close my eyes at night. We were supposed to be running a quiet undercover operation in the mountains near Glacier National Park. There had been reports of an illegal drug operation using the wilderness trails as transport routes, people hiking with duffel bags, night camps appearing and disappearing, and even signs of small airdrops in the deeper valleys. My unit was tasked to monitor an area about 15 miles north of the main road, somewhere no normal camper would ever wander. There were 4 of us: me, Officer Raymond, our team lead, Officer Briggs, our scout, and Officer Nolan, communications. We packed light, basic tents, trail food, and our weapons. We hiked deep into the forest, further than any trails, setting up a small camp in a clearing surrounded by thick pine and cedar trees. The place smelled of resin and wet soil. The ground was soft with layers of moss, and the silence there felt unnatural. No sound of people, barely any birds, only the occasional distant crack of branches. The first night went quietly. We set up our tents, checked our perimeter, and took turns on watch. I remember the temperature dropping fast once the sun went down. The forest became completely dark, pitch black except for the weak glow of our small fire. I was on watch around 2 a.m. I kept scanning the treeline with my flashlight. Everything was dead still until I heard faint steps. Not close, but distant, somewhere in the woods. Slow, dragging, uneven. Then they stopped. I waited for maybe 10 minutes, shining the light toward the direction of the sound. But there was nothing, just silence. The next morning, Briggs went scouting down the ridge about a mile from camp. He came back looking uneasy. He said he'd found a small clearing with what looked like old trash, burned cans, torn plastic, cigarette butts, and tire marks pressed into the dirt. Someone had been out there recently. We decided to extend our surveillance for another night. By late afternoon, we heard something faint, a hum that didn't belong in the forest. Took us a second to realize it was a small plane somewhere above us. It wasn't high, you could tell by the sound. Then, a few seconds later, something fell through the trees. We couldn't see it clearly through the canopy, but we heard it, branches breaking, a heavy thud. It had to be one of those airdrops we were briefed about. We decided not to move in daylight. We waited for dusk, then packed our gear and quietly moved toward the area where we thought it landed. Took us nearly 40 minutes of silent hiking to reach the spot. When we did, we found a torn-up tarp hanging in the trees and a large duffel bag on the ground. It was black, dirty, and heavy, too heavy for camping supplies. Inside were vacuum-sealed packs of what looked like white powder. It was exactly what we were looking for. We radioed the base for extraction plans, but communication was weak. Barely any signal in that valley. Nolan tried to boost it, but the best we got was a broken confirmation that backup would move toward the area by sunrise. We had to hold position until morning. We moved the duffel bag back to our campsite, keeping it hidden behind a fallen log, and decided to stay alert for the rest of the night. But things didn't stay quiet for long. Around midnight, I was half awake in my tent when I heard footsteps again. This time much closer, crisp against the pine needles. I froze. It wasn't one person, it was at least 2, maybe 3. I unzipped the tent quietly, peeked out, and saw faint movement between the trees. Shadows low and fast. They weren't animals. I reached for my rifle and signaled Raymond, who was already sitting up, eyes wide. We killed our lanterns and waited, crouched low near the tents. The footsteps circled our camp slowly, stopping now and then. Then, The beam of a flashlight swept across the clearing for a brief second. Whoever it was, they were looking for something, and I knew it had to be the duffel bag. For nearly 20 minutes, we stayed completely still. Then, suddenly, a twig snapped about 10 feet away. Raymond motioned for me to stay quiet, but the moment he shifted his foot, a branch cracked under him, and that tiny sound set everything off. A voice shouted from the trees, angry, sharp. Then the beam of another flashlight hit our camp, and before we could even move, bullets tore through the darkness. We dove behind the log. The gunfire was loud and messy, echoing through the forest. Dirt kicked up near my hands as rounds hit the ground. Raymond yelled for us to fall back toward the ridge. We crawled low, moving through the brush, trying to circle around without exposing ourselves. I could hear Nolan breathing hard behind me, clutching the comms pack. When the shooting stopped, there was only the sound of heavy footsteps moving closer. I could see faint shapes, 3 of them, flashlights scanning the trees, searching. They were armed. One of them kicked at the tents, another checked near the fire pit. They found the duffel bag. I watched as one knelt down, unzipped it, and cursed under his breath. They didn't take it right away. Instead, they started arguing quietly among themselves, though I couldn't hear what they were saying. We stayed hidden until they started dragging the bag away. Once they were out of sight, we moved. Raymond wanted to follow them at a distance so we could track where they were heading, but as we made our way through the dark, we lost visual contact completely. The forest swallowed them. By morning, the sun was up, and the forest looked strangely normal again. Quiet, bright, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But our camp was a mess. Tents shredded by bullets, footprints all over, and empty shell casings scattered in the dirt. We searched the area, found bloodstains near a fallen branch, but no bodies. They must have taken their wounded with them. When backup finally reached us around noon, we guided them to the clearing where the drop had happened. The tarp was still there, but the duffel bag and any sign of the men were gone. We combed the woods for hours, but the trail went cold. The tire tracks Briggs found earlier were still visible but faded into a stream bed that led nowhere. We reported everything: gunfire, the duffel, the suspects, but the official follow-up never led to arrests. The forest out there is endless, and those people knew it better than we did. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that night. The sudden gunfire, the flashlight beams cutting through the dark, the smell of dirt and gunpowder. There's something different about being hunted in the dark like that, knowing someone's out there and you can't see them but they can see you. Months later, a forest ranger reported finding a burned-out campsite about 3 miles north of where we'd been. Among the ashes were melted plastic and what looked like pieces of torn duffel fabric. Maybe it was them getting rid of evidence. Maybe it wasn't. The department filed it as part of the same case, but it never went anywhere. Years have passed now, and I still go out camping sometimes, but I can't sit comfortably in silence anymore. Every crack of a twig or rustle of branches feels like something watching. It's strange how the forest can look peaceful in the day and turn into something entirely different at night. That operation was supposed to be simple: a watch, a report, maybe a small bust. Instead, it reminded me that even in the middle of nowhere, you're never truly alone. Somewhere out there, in those woods, there are people who know every hidden trail, every sound the forest makes, and they don't want to be found. And sometimes, if you do find them, you don't make it back the same. I went to the Amazon in the summer of 2017. I was 29 back then, working as a field photographer for a travel magazine that liked sending people into miserable, remote places for raw shots. The Amazon sounded thrilling at first: miles of untouched forest, endless wildlife. the idea of sleeping beneath a sky that felt alive. But nothing about that trip went how I imagined. It's still hard to think about sometimes. I had planned a 3-day camping trip along the Tapajos River, deep inside the Brazilian rainforest. A local guide dropped me off by boat at a spot that looked calm and open enough to set up camp. The plan was simple: hike through part of the forest during the day, take pictures, and spend the nights near the river. The air was heavy from the moment I stepped off the boat, thicker than anything I'd ever breathed. Everything was wet, even things that looked dry had a kind of damp film over them. By late afternoon, I had my tent up, a small fire going, and my gear laid out. The sounds were constant. 1,000 different insects and birds mixing into one endless hum. It was so loud it felt like silence didn't exist there. The forest moved all the time, like it was breathing. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing something walking in the water near the riverbank, slow and careful. I thought maybe it was a caiman or a capybara, but every time I shined my flashlight, the water went still. Then the forest would go quiet for a few seconds, that thick kind of quiet where everything freezes before starting again, louder. The second day, I hiked deeper into the trees, following a narrow animal path that led uphill. The ground was soft and uneven, and every step made the wet soil suck at my boots. The air smelled of rot, sweet, earthy decay from fallen fruit and old leaves. I saw a few monkeys watching me from above, their black eyes still and curious. I took photos until the light started to fade, then turned back toward camp. But on my way back, I noticed something odd. Broken branches higher up on trees, like someone taller than me had been moving through that same area not long before. I didn't think much of it until I found footprints near the edge of a clearing. They weren't mine. They were longer, thinner, barefoot. I crouched down and touched one. It was still soft around the edges, fresh. My first thought was that maybe some local hunter had passed through, or someone from a nearby tribe. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone since being dropped off. When I got back to camp, it was almost dark. My small fire had gone out, and one of my packs was open. I kept telling myself an animal did it. I didn't want to admit that it looked like someone had unzipped it, not torn it open. Nothing was missing though. My food, camera, even my knife were still there. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder that night. Around midnight, it started raining hard. The kind of rain that feels like it's trying to bury you. The sound drowned everything. I lay in my tent, water dripping from the seams, my flashlight flickering every few minutes. Then I heard a sound that didn't fit, a deep, slow breathing just outside the tent. I froze. It wasn't the snort of an animal or the rustling of leaves. It sounded human. For what felt like an hour, I didn't move. I could hear it circling, soft steps in the mud. My hand was shaking on the flashlight. I wanted to look, but I couldn't. At some point, the breathing faded, replaced by the rain again. I must have stayed awake the rest of the night, counting the seconds between thunderclaps. In the morning, I stepped out and saw new footprints around the tent, barefoot again. Long strides circling me like they were inspecting. My stomach sank. I didn't take pictures this time. I just packed what I could and decided to move closer to the river, maybe set up a new camp near the open shore where I could see more around me. By midday, the rain had stopped, and the heat came back worse than before. I followed the riverbank for about an hour, but something didn't feel right. I started noticing bits of trash, an old plastic bottle, a torn piece of tarp, even what looked like a bit of rope tied to a tree. That shouldn't have been there. That area was supposed to be untouched. I came across a small clearing that looked like it had been used before. There were ashes from an old fire and something that looked like part of a broken shoe. But the thing that made me stop was a pile of bones near a fallen log. They weren't animal bones. They were small, clean, picked apart. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there, but I started feeling like I was being watched again. that crawling feeling up the back of my neck, the one you get when someone's behind you. I turned around, but there was only the forest. The trees seemed too close together now, darker than before. I left that place fast, trying to make it back to where the boat had dropped me off. The problem was the river bends and twists so much that it's easy to lose direction. Everything looked the same: green walls of vines and mud, the sound of water, insects screaming in your ears. I kept checking my GPS, but the battery was dying. As the light started to fade again, I finally spotted a familiar fallen tree and thought I was close. That's when I saw movement across the river. A man was standing there, half hidden behind the trees. No shirt, just a pair of dirty shorts. He was thin, almost too thin, his skin dark and covered in mud. He wasn't moving toward me, just standing still, staring. I froze. He didn't say anything, didn't move at all, just kept watching me. I slowly backed away, trying not to look away from him. After maybe 10 steps, I turned and started walking faster, then running. The forest swallowed me up again. I didn't stop until I couldn't hear the river anymore. That night, I didn't even set up my tent. I sat against a tree with my knife in my hand, shaking, listening to every sound. I could hear something moving in the distance, snapping branches. Once, I thought I saw a shadow between the trees, but I told myself it was the rain playing tricks. When the morning came, I forced myself to keep walking toward the GPS marker where the boat was supposed to pick me up the next day. I barely ate. I was running on fear and exhaustion. Every noise made me jump. The forest felt alive, like it was closing in around me. By the time I reached the pickup point, my clothes were ripped and covered in mud. The boat wasn't there yet, but I didn't care. I sat on the muddy bank with my camera bag clutched to my chest and waited, eyes on the treeline. I didn't move until I saw the guide's boat appear around the bend hours later. When I climbed aboard, he looked at me like he knew something had happened. I didn't say a word the whole ride back. Couldn't. Later, when I checked the photos on my camera, I found one I didn't remember taking. It was from the second night. Blurry, dark, aimed toward the trees near my tent. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was the outline of a man. I deleted it right after. I never went back to the Amazon after that. I still work outdoors sometimes, but only where I can see open sky and people nearby. The thing that haunts me most isn't what I saw, but what I didn't see. The quiet footsteps, the breathing in the dark, and the feeling that whoever was out there had been watching me long before I ever noticed. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping on an old farm in southern Kentucky. I was 24 at the time, living a pretty plain life, working long shifts at a hardware store, sleeping late, and repeating it all over again. I needed a break from everything, and I didn't have the money for any kind of real vacation. A friend of mine mentioned this huge abandoned property his uncle used to own, miles away from any town, with open fields, some old barns, and a stretch of woods behind it. He said people used to camp out there sometimes, so I figured why not. I packed my tent, a small cooler, a flashlight, and enough food for a weekend. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I just wanted to be away from people for a while. I got there around noon on a Friday. The road leading to the farm was narrow and rough, full of cracks and weeds breaking through the asphalt. It had clearly not been used much for years. The land stretched out endlessly on both sides. Flat fields with tall grass, patches of trees, and an old barbed wire fence running along the edge. The sky was wide and pale blue, and it was one of those hot, still days where the air barely moved. When I finally reached the gate, it was hanging crooked on one hinge, with rusted metal and vines tangled around it. I parked my car just off the dirt road and walked in with my gear. The farm itself looked forgotten. The house was nothing but a rotting frame, roof half gone, windows smashed, and walls leaning inward. A few barns and sheds stood around it, their wooden boards gray and split. There was a strong smell of old hay, soil, and something else, like stale water or mold. I picked a spot about 50 yards from the main barn, near a patch of trees that offered a bit of shade. The grass was dry and yellow, and I could hear insects buzzing everywhere. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and tried to settle in. As the sun went down, the air cooled, and everything got quiet except for the sound of crickets. The open fields looked darker than I expected, like the night swallowed them completely. The old barn loomed in the distance, tall and uneven, its doors barely hanging on. I remember feeling uneasy for no clear reason, but I brushed it off as nerves. It was my first time camping alone. Around 9 or 10 p.m., I noticed a faint light in the distance. It wasn't bright, just a dull flicker somewhere deeper across the field, near the tree line. I thought maybe it was someone's farmhouse or maybe a lantern from another camper. But this place was supposed to be miles from anyone else. The light would fade, then appear again, slightly to the left or right, as if someone was walking slowly with it. I told myself it was nothing and went into the tent. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight, but I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. It was dead silent outside. Not even the crickets were making noise anymore. It was strange how heavy that silence felt, like it pressed against my ears. Then, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the grass. Slow, heavy steps coming from the direction of the barn. I froze, holding my breath, thinking it could be an animal. But the steps were too steady, too human. They crunched through the dry grass, stopping now and then, like whoever it was kept pausing to listen. I stayed completely still, trying to make sense of it. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly. The footsteps stopped near my tent for what felt like a full minute. I could almost feel someone standing there, just outside the thin fabric. Then the sound started again, walking away this time, heading toward the woods. I didn't dare look outside. I just stayed there, staring at the roof of my tent, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. The next morning, I got out and checked around. There were flattened patches of grass near the tent, like someone had walked through during the night. I looked for prints, but the ground was too dry to show any clear ones. Still, it was obvious someone or something had been there. I thought about packing up, but I convinced myself maybe I'd imagined it. I didn't want to drive hours back just because I got spooked. I spent most of the day exploring the place. Behind the barn, I found a large pit, half filled with junk. Old tools, broken glass, rusted metal, and what looked like the frame of an old truck. The barn itself was full of empty feed sacks and a few rotted barrels. By afternoon, I felt more relaxed again. I cooked some food, sat in the shade, and tried to enjoy the quiet. When evening came, the light turned orange and the sky went hazy. I kept glancing at the tree line where I'd seen the flicker the night before. I didn't see anything, but as soon as it got dark, I started feeling uneasy again. Around 11 p.m., the wind picked up and started moving through the tall grass, making a low, whispering sound. My fire had died down, and I was sitting there with my flashlight on my lap, listening. Then I heard a noise again. Not footsteps this time, but the creak of something metal moving. It sounded like the barn door swaying back and forth. I aimed my flashlight toward it, and that's when I saw something. The door was open now, and someone was standing halfway inside. The light caught a shape, a man, or what looked like one. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there in the darkness, facing my direction. I couldn't see his face, only his outline, and what looked like a long coat hanging off him. My whole body went cold. I didn't know what to do. I shut the flashlight off, hoping he hadn't noticed me. I sat there in the dark, waiting, listening. A few seconds later, the creaking stopped. When I turned the light on again, The door was closed. He was gone. I went straight into my tent and zipped it up, heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, like something brushing through the grass, then a distant metallic clank. I was counting the hours until daylight. When morning finally came, I stepped out carefully. The air felt heavy, humid. I looked toward the barn and I froze. There were fresh marks in the dirt, boot prints, clear ones this time, going from the barn to my tent and then back again. Whoever had been there last night had come right up to where I was sitting. That's when I decided I was leaving. I packed everything as fast as I could, not even bothering to fold the tent properly. As I was walking back toward my car, I noticed something near the fence line. It was an old truck parked halfway in the tall grass, rusted out and covered in dirt. I hadn't seen it before. The back door was open, and inside were piles of old blankets, bottles, and wrappers, like someone had been living there recently. There were even boot prints leading from the truck toward the barn. That was enough for me. I got in my car and drove out of there without looking back. A few weeks later, I looked up the place online. It turned out that part of the property used to belong to a man who disappeared years ago after being suspected of breaking into nearby farms. They said he lived off abandoned land, sleeping in barns and sheds, stealing food, and moving every few months to avoid being caught. No one ever found him. Some thought he died out there somewhere. Others believed he was still around, drifting from place to place. I never went camping alone again after that. Every time I pass an open field or an old barn, I still get that same uneasy feeling in my stomach. The same one I had that night when I saw the figure standing in the barn. Sometimes I think about how quiet it was, how close he must have been, standing just outside my tent in the dark, listening to me breathe. And what keeps me up most nights is knowing he didn't just stumble upon that place by accident. He had been living there. I had been camping in his spot. It was late September 2016. The weather had started to cool down a bit, that perfect in-between of summer heat and fall chill. I had taken a few days off work to clear my head, and I decided to drive out to a forested area in northern Minnesota with my dog, a 6-year-old black Labrador named Ranger. I'd always found comfort in the quiet, away from traffic, phones, and people. Just me, my dog, and the steady sound of the wind pushing through trees. The drive took about 5 hours. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was leaning low, that orange kind of light stretching through the trees. I found a spot near a small creek, a little clearing surrounded by tall pines. The air was clean and sharp with that earthy smell of damp leaves and wood. I parked the truck off the dirt trail, unloaded my gear, and started setting up camp. Ranger sniffed around, tail wagging, running through the brush, occasionally stopping to stare at something invisible to me. I hammered the tent stakes deep, unpacked the cooler, and set up a small fire ring with rocks I found nearby. The forest was quiet except for the occasional crack of branches under his paws and the water moving down the creek. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and dinner warming on a pan. Just canned chili and bread, simple stuff. Ranger sat close to the fire, his eyes catching the light. The night settled heavy, thick with the sound of crickets and distant frogs. I remember looking up and seeing the stars clearer than I'd seen them in years, scattered across the black sky. The temperature dropped fast, and I wrapped myself in my jacket, leaning against a log as Ranger curled up by my feet. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something moving near the tent. The fire had burned down to red embers. I sat still, trying to focus. Ranger's ears were perked up, his body tense. He gave a low growl, not loud, just that deep warning sound he made when something wasn't right. I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the dark. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the trees, the shapes of bushes, the gleam of the creek. Then I caught a glimpse of movement. Quick, low, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I thought it was a deer at first, but the sound it made wasn't like any deer I'd heard. It was heavier, slower, like something moving on two legs, stepping carefully. I told myself it was probably another camper or a hunter, maybe lost. But there were no vehicles near mine when I arrived, and this area wasn't known for many visitors. Ranger stood up, his fur slightly raised, and kept staring toward the sound. It faded after a few minutes, and I sat awake for a long time after that, listening. Morning came cold and gray. The ground was wet from dew, and the air smelled like smoke and pine. I walked down to the creek with Ranger, letting him drink while I washed my face. Across the water, I noticed faint footprints in the mud. They weren't clear, but they were definitely human. Barefoot, maybe. It was hard to tell. They weren't mine and they weren't old. Edges still sharp, not filled in by water or leaves. I felt that strange pressure in my chest, that quiet kind of unease you can't explain. I decided not to think much of it. Maybe someone had passed through the night before. Still, I kept my knife closer on me and made sure my truck keys stayed in my pocket. The day went by slow. I spent it hiking along the trail, checking out an old logging road I'd seen on the map. Ranger stayed close, nose to the ground, tail moving slowly. The forest was thicker deeper in. Tall birches, fallen logs covered in moss, sunlight breaking through in dusty streaks. Every so often, I'd hear something far off, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but it always stopped when I did. By evening, I was back at camp, tired but calm. I made another fire, fed Ranger, ate some jerky and crackers, and sat watching the light fade. The forest turned that deep blue color right before dark. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears locked toward the tree line. I heard it again, that same slow movement through the brush. I stood up this time, flashlight ready, heart thudding so loud it felt like it echoed in my throat. The sound stopped. I swept the light across the trees. Nothing. Then, a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against metal, came from the direction of my truck. I walked toward it slowly, every step careful on the damp leaves. Ranger followed close. When I reached the truck, I saw it immediately. The driver's door was slightly open. I knew for certain I'd shut it. My stomach dropped. I shined the light inside. Nothing missing at first glance. Backpack still there, cooler in the back, glove box closed. Then I noticed it. Muddy prints on the side of the door. Not paw prints, not shoe prints either. Just smudged, wide, bare shapes. I shut the door hard, locked it, and went back to the fire. Ranger wouldn't settle. He kept pacing, ears twitching toward the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the dying fire, gripping my flashlight and knife, trying to listen through the sounds of the woods. Around 3 a.m., the forest went completely silent. No crickets, no frost, no wind. Just stillness. I could hear my own breathing and Ranger's slow growl. Then, faintly, I heard it again, that same movement closer this time. The firelight flickered, and I saw the outline of something behind the trees. Tall, maybe 6 feet, moving slow. My hand shook so hard I could barely hold the light steady. It stood there for a few seconds, maybe longer, then turned and disappeared into the dark. I stayed frozen. Ranger barked once, sharp and deep, and that broke the silence. Whatever it was crashed through the trees, moving fast now. I could hear branches snapping, footsteps fading away until they were gone completely. I didn't wait until morning. I threw my gear into the truck as soon as the first light showed between the trees. Ranger jumped in, tail down, still tense. The air felt heavy, damp, like the forest was holding its breath. When I started the engine, I saw something in the mud by the fire pit, another footprint. Bare, long toes spread wide. Fresh. I drove the dirt road back toward the highway without looking in the mirrors. My hands gripped the wheel so hard they hurt. When we finally hit the paved road, I pulled over and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. Ranger climbed into the front seat and pressed against me, whining softly. When I got home that afternoon, I checked everything again, trying to make sense of it. There was nothing missing from the truck, no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen. Just those prints and that feeling that someone or something human had been watching us. A few days later, I told one of my friends who hunts up north about it. He told me that part of the forest used to have squatters years ago. People living deep in the woods, far from anyone, surviving off what they could find. Most left when the land was bought up, but he said every now and then, someone still spots signs that people live out there. Hidden shelters, old fires, food wrappers miles from any trail. It made sense as much as I wanted it not to. Maybe it was someone still living out there, someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe they just came through my camp to see what I had, to scare me off. If that was their goal, it worked. I've never gone back there since. Sometimes, when I walk Ranger at night near my house, and I hear something move in the trees, that same uneasy feeling comes back. Like someone standing just out of sight, watching quietly. But I remind myself, it's not the forest that scared me that night. It was knowing how quiet a person can be when they want to. It was late October of 2016, and I had taken a few days off work to go camping alone in the Lake District, up in the north of England. I was 28 back then, and it was the first real break I'd given myself in months. I'd planned to spend 3 nights out there, away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. Just silence, air, and space. I packed light. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a small gas stove, and enough food for a few days. The plan was to set up camp near a quiet patch of forest, not too far from a small stream I'd seen on the map. The drive from Manchester took around 3 hours. The roads narrowed the deeper I went, twisting through hills and tiny villages until I finally reached a small gravel pull-off by the woods. The sky was heavy with clouds, that dull gray that feels like it's holding back rain. I parked the car and started walking down a narrow trail, carrying everything on my back. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled damp and earthy. It was colder than I expected, but the quietness of it all made it worth it. No engines, no voices, just whined through the branches. After an hour or so, I found a good spot. A small clearing surrounded by tall, thin trees, with the stream a short walk downhill. It looked untouched. I pitched my tent there and set up a small fire pit with a ring of stones. The light faded early that day, the kind of dim that sneaks up fast in autumn. I cooked a quick meal, warmed some soup on the little stove, and sat watching the fire until only the embers glowed. That first night was peaceful. The wind rattled the tent a bit, and a light drizzle came and went, but I slept fine. The next morning, I hiked further into the woods, following the stream as it curved north. I saw no one, not a single hiker or camper. Around mid-afternoon, the weather turned colder, and I decided to head back. On the way, I noticed something odd. An old, half-broken wooden fence running parallel to the stream, with pieces missing and moss covering most of it. Behind it were the remains of what looked like a stone wall, maybe from an old farm boundary or something. It looked forgotten. That night, I built another small fire and ate in silence again. It was darker than the night before, no moon visible through the thick clouds. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard a sound that didn't fit. It wasn't an animal. It was a slow, steady crunching, like boots on wet leaves. It stopped and started again. My first thought was that maybe someone was hiking late or maybe a local checking the area. but something about it felt off. The steps weren't in a clear direction. They circled, pausing and continuing again. I lay still, breathing slow, listening. Then silence. I waited for a long time before drifting back to sleep. The next morning, when I stepped outside the tent, the first thing I saw was a small footprint in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was deeper, larger, with the heel pressed in more than the front. It had rained lightly, so it couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I looked around but saw nothing else disturbed. No sign of anyone nearby. I told myself it was probably just someone walking by early in the morning. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came with knowing someone had been close to my tent while I was asleep. That day, I didn't hike far. I stayed around the camp, gathered some dry wood, and cleaned the area near the stream. Every now and then, I looked around the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The forest was dead quiet except for the sound of the stream and the occasional crow in the distance. By late afternoon, I decided I would pack up early the next morning and head home. Something about the place didn't feel right anymore. That night, I didn't start a fire. I didn't want the light to give away my position if anyone was around. I ate cold food, zipped myself into the tent, and tried to sleep early. But the unease was stronger this time. Around 2 a.m., I woke again. This time not from noise, but from a faint flicker of light outside. Through the thin layer of the tent, I could see the faint, unsteady glow of what looked like a flashlight or a lantern, moving slowly between the trees. It wasn't far, maybe 20, 30 meters away. It moved in small arcs, like someone sweeping the beam side to side. My chest felt tight. I didn't move a muscle. The light stayed for a while, sometimes still, sometimes moving. I couldn't hear footsteps, just the faint rustle of leaves. Then it went out completely. I waited for minutes, maybe longer, before peeking out through the small zip opening. The forest was pitch dark again. Nothing moved. I barely slept that night, every small sound making me jolt awake. When the first bit of daylight came, I got out and looked around again. I found nothing, no tracks, no sign of anyone. I started packing right then. I wanted out of there, but when I went to collect the trash bag I'd left tied to a branch a few meters from my tent, I froze. The bag had been torn open, not by an animal. The knot was undone cleanly, and the contents, empty cans, wrappers, some old food scraps, were scattered neatly in a small pile, almost arranged. Someone had done that. Not a fox, not the wind. Someone had gone through my things. I didn't even stop to eat breakfast. I packed everything in a rush, double-checking the ground for anything left behind. As I started walking back toward the trail, I kept turning around, convinced someone was behind me. The forest felt different in daylight, less peaceful, more watchful. About halfway back to where I'd parked, the path split near that same old wooden fence I'd noticed before. I don't know why, but I glanced over it one more time, and that's when I saw him. He was standing maybe 50 meters away, partly behind a tree, facing my direction. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the gray light. He looked tall, maybe 6 feet or more, wearing a dark jacket and trousers that looked too big, muddy at the bottom. His face wasn't clear, just pale and still with short hair. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, completely still, like he'd been watching me for a while. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I didn't run right away. I just started walking faster, not taking my eyes off him. When I finally looked back again, he was gone. I don't know if he stepped behind the trees or walked off, but he vanished from sight. That was enough for me. I ran the rest of the way back. When I reached the car, I locked the doors and sat there for a few seconds, shaking. The woods behind me were silent again, but I couldn't stop picturing that man standing there, motionless, watching. I started the engine and drove until I hit the main road. I didn't look in the mirror much, just focused on getting out of there. When I got home, I dumped my gear in the garage and didn't touch it for weeks. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because it didn't feel like something I could explain properly. It wasn't just fear. It was that deep, crawling feeling that someone had been around me for days without me realizing it. Someone had been close enough to touch my things, to walk circles around my tent at night, to watch me in the dark. A few months later, out of curiosity, I looked up old reports about that area. There had been a few disappearances over the years, hikers who never came back. Nothing recent, but enough to make me feel sick thinking about it. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Sometimes when I drive through quiet areas or stop by woods, I still catch myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see that same figure again. Just standing there, watching, waiting for me to look back. It was mid-September 2014. The weather was starting to cool down, but the days were still long enough to make camping feel worth it. I had just turned 25 a few months before, and after weeks of sitting behind a desk, I wanted nothing more than to get away from everything for a few days. I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and my old hiking boots, and drove north into the Scottish Highlands. I wasn't going to a campsite, just a quiet place near a lake I'd found years ago while hiking with a friend. It was completely out of the way, no mobile signal, no people, just wild open space and still water. It took me almost 5 hours to reach it. The dirt road that led to the lake had become narrower since the last time I was there, with branches brushing against both sides of the car as I drove through. I parked a few hundred meters from the water, near a slope covered with damp grass and scattered rocks. It was already late afternoon, the kind of gray light that makes it hard to tell the time. I unpacked slowly, setting up the tent while listening to the soft sound of the wind in the trees. The silence was the first thing I noticed once I stopped moving. There weren't many birds, and the air felt heavy, like it had just rained even though it hadn't. I walked down to the water, crouched and touched it. It was freezing. The smell of mud and pine hung in the air. After setting up camp, I lit a small fire using some dry wood I brought, cooked a tin of beans, and sat near the flames until the darkness crept in. I didn't bother checking the time, but it must have been around 9 p.m. The moon was only half full, but it gave enough light to see the outline of the trees across the lake. The night felt thick. There were no city lights, no faint traffic hum, just the fire crackling and the occasional sound of water moving gently against the shore. I started to feel uneasy around midnight. There was no specific reason for it. It was just that sense you get when the quiet starts to feel too perfect. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I could hear something faint, like the snapping of a twig, somewhere in the distance. I tried to ignore it. Forests make sounds, animals move at night, that's normal. But then there was another sound, slow, crunching steps in the grass, not quick like a deer or rabbit. It sounded deliberate, heavy. I sat still and listened, holding my breath, stopped for a while, then started again, closer. My flashlight was inside the tent, a few feet away. I didn't move. I just stared out into the darkness. The footsteps came from the tree line, the side opposite the lake. They weren't rushing, just slow, steady movements that stopped and started again. After a minute, everything went silent again. I waited. Nothing. I finally stood up, grabbed my flashlight from the tent, and scanned the edge of the trees. The beam cut through the dark but revealed nothing, just the texture of bark and leaves. I turned in a slow circle, checking behind me. Nothing but the lake. I told myself it was probably an animal and forced myself to lie down in the tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside made my body tense. I lay awake for what felt like hours, until finally, I drifted off. When I woke up, the light outside was dim but blue, the kind that comes right before sunrise. My mouth was dry, and I could smell cold ash from the fire pit. As I unzipped the tent to get out, I froze. There were footprints in the mud near the fire. Not boot prints, bare feet. The ground was soft, and I could see them clearly. They started near the trees and went all the way around the fire, then toward the tent, stopping just a few steps from where I slept. The prints were large, definitely not a child's, and spaced like whoever it was had been walking slowly. I looked around, scanning the trees, my heart pounding so hard it made my chest hurt. No one was there. No sign of anything. The air was completely still. I didn't bother cooking breakfast. I just poured some water over the fire pit, packed my gear as fast as I could, and threw everything into the car. I told myself I'd just drive back to the main road and find a safer place to rest. But something about leaving felt wrong too, like I was being watched the entire time I packed. I didn't see anyone, but I kept catching myself glancing at the trees again and again. The drive back down that dirt track was worse. The narrow road forced me to move slowly, maybe 20 miles an hour at most. The trees leaned in close, branches scraping the car roof now and then. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror even though there was nothing to see. I swear I caught a glimpse of something once, a shape between two trunks, but it was gone so fast I might have imagined it. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped the car and just sat there for a while, trying to calm myself. It was barely morning, the sun still low and weak. I looked down at my phone. No signal still. I decided to keep driving south until I found a service station. About an hour later, I stopped at one. I bought a coffee, sat in the car park, and tried to convince myself that it had been nothing more than a local wandering at night, or maybe some hiker who stumbled into my area. But something didn't add up. The prints, bare feet wide, deep into the mud, those weren't from someone casually walking around. It had rained lightly during the night, and the prints were fresh, pressed on top of the damp layer. Whoever had made them had come while I was asleep. That thought stayed with me for days. I kept replaying the night in my head, thinking maybe I'd heard more sounds than I realized, or maybe I should have seen something when I shone the light into the woods. A week later, I went through my camping bag to unpack properly, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of my tent stakes was missing. I knew I'd packed them all because I counted when I set it up. I always did. There were supposed to be 8, but only 7 were there. I searched every pocket of the bag, every part of the tent roll, even the car trunk. It was just gone. Maybe I dropped it when I packed too fast, or maybe I left it by the fire without noticing. That's what I told myself at first. But then I remembered how the prints had circled the fire, how they had stopped right near the tent, just a few feet from my head while I was sleeping. The missing stake didn't feel like something I'd lost. It felt like something that had been taken. I never went back to that lake again. I thought about it once, maybe a year later, when I saw a picture online of a campsite nearby. The ground looked the same quiet water, the same line of trees on the far side. I could almost feel that same cold air on my face. But the thought of stepping back there made my skin crawl. It wasn't the idea of danger that scared me most. It was the thought of not knowing who or what had been there with me that night, walking barefoot in the mud, circling my fire while I slept only a thin layer of fabric away. Even now, sometimes when I go camping with friends, I wake up in the middle of the night and check the ground outside the tent, half expecting to see those same prints again. Nothing has ever shown up since. But that night, in that lonely part of Scotland, something or someone stood just a few feet away from me, and I'll never know why. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip across northern Arizona. I had just turned 28 and was working long hours at a construction company in Flagstaff. Life had started to feel like a loop, Same routine, same noise, same streets. I wanted to clear my head and get some quiet time, so I picked a remote area near the Kaibab National Forest. I'd read online that it was peaceful, not many tourists, and had miles of pine forests, rocky trails, and open clearings. That was exactly what I needed. I drove out early one Friday morning in my old gray pickup. The road stretched for hours, empty most of the time except for the occasional semi-truck roaring past. The further I got, the more the world seemed to thin out. Fewer houses, fewer road signs, just long ribbons of asphalt surrounded by empty fields and dark green treelines. When I reached the entrance to a narrow dirt road that led into the forest, I turned off the GPS. The road was rough, covered with patches of gravel and fallen branches. It twisted deeper and deeper into the trees. I didn't see another vehicle for miles. By the time I found a spot to camp, the sun was low and the sky was painted orange and pink. I parked beside a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The air was cooler up there, with that clean forest smell of pine and dry earth. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, made a small fire pit, and unpacked some food and a folding chair. It felt good to be away from everything. No voices, no machines, no buzzing city lights. That first night was quiet. I cooked some beans and hot dogs over the fire and watched the stars come out one by one. The night sky in that part of Arizona was incredible. So dark that the stars looked sharper than I'd ever seen. I sat for hours just listening to the fire pop and the wind whisper through the trees. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the grass. It was peaceful in a way that made me forget about everything waiting for me back home. But around midnight, the peace started to feel different. The forest had a strange stillness, like the air had gone heavy. I noticed how quiet it suddenly got. The crickets stopped. Even the wind stopped moving. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the whole place was holding its breath. I remember sitting completely still, staring into the dark tree line. My fire had burned low, and the glow barely reached the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was just a coyote or maybe a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me from the dark. After a few minutes, the quiet broke. A snap of a branch deep in the trees. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was the heavy kind of snap that came from something big stepping on it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the beam only lit up the first few trees. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched got worse. My skin prickled, and my chest felt tight. I told myself to relax, threw a few more logs on the fire, and sat back down. The sounds didn't come again, but the silence stayed until I fell asleep inside my tent. The next morning, the forest looked calm again. Sunlight cut through the branches, and the air smelled fresh after the cool night. I made coffee and walked around the clearing. About 20 yards away, I found footprints, not boots or shoes, but bare feet. They were bigger than mine, with deep imprints in the soft dirt. The tracks came from the trees, stopped near my fire pit, and turned back into the woods. I just stared at them for a long time. They didn't look fresh enough to be from the night before, but they weren't old either. The ground wasn't dry yet, and the edges of the prints still looked sharp. I tried to reason it out. Maybe a local hiker? Maybe someone just wandering barefoot? But this place was miles off any trail or road. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. I tried to ignore it for the rest of the day. I went for a hike, took pictures, cooked lunch, and tried to enjoy the quiet again. But that image, the footprints by my camp, kept circling in my mind. I started noticing other little things too. Small details I'd missed before. A tree about 30 feet from my tent had scratch marks down its bark, like someone had dragged a knife or a rock across it. There was also a pile of old, burned wood deeper in the forest that looked like another campsite. but the ashes were cold and gray, like it had been abandoned for weeks. There was even a metal coffee mug still half buried in the dirt. When evening came again, I built the fire higher and stayed close to it. The air turned cold fast. I didn't go for a walk, didn't wander off to look at the stars this time. I just sat by the fire, listening. Around 10 p.m., the forest went silent again. That same heavy quiet. I could hear my own breathing. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning back and forth, slow and steady. Then I caught movement just for a second. Something tall, slipping behind a tree. My stomach dropped. I stood up, shining the light toward where I'd seen it, but there was nothing now. The darkness seemed to swallow the beam whole. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but the noise I heard next proved it wasn't. The sound of slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. Not running, not wandering, walking. I went inside my truck, locked the doors, and sat there for hours with the flashlight off, gripping the handle of my knife. I could hear the faintest movements outside, like someone circling, stepping on twigs every few minutes, always keeping distance. Around 3 a.m., the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I packed everything fast. My hands were shaking, and I kept checking over my shoulder. When I went to take down the tent, I saw a clear footprint right behind it. Another bare one, same as before, pressed deep into the soil. I threw everything into the truck and started the engine. The drive back down that dirt road felt endless. I didn't look back once. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over and sat for a while, just breathing. I kept thinking about those footprints, how close they were to my tent, how quiet the person or whatever it was must have been to get that close without me hearing. I tried to make sense of it for weeks afterward, but I couldn't. I told a few people from work about it later, but they laughed and said it was probably a homeless person or some hiker lost in the woods. Maybe it was. But even now, when I think about that night, about the slow steps circling my camp and the prints that came and went without sound, it doesn't feel like something random. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore. I always pick spots with other people nearby, places with lights and sounds and signs of life. And every time I set up camp, I look for footprints first. I never found out who or what was out there in Kaibab that night, but I'm sure of one thing: I wasn't alone. And whoever it was, they'd been there long before I arrived.